Chapter 4, Part 2 of The Subjection of Women. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nikki Sullivan. The Subjection of Women by John Stuart Mill. Chapter 4, Part 2. These considerations show how usefully the part which women take in the formation of general opinion would be modified for the better by that more enlarged instruction and practical conversancy with the things which their opinions influence that would necessarily arise from their social and political emancipation. But the improvement it would work through the influence they exercise, each in her own family, would be still more remarkable. It is often said that in the classes most exposed to temptation, a man's wife and children tend to keep him honest and respectable, both by the wife's direct influence and by the concern she feels for their future welfare. This may be so, and no doubt often is so, with those who are more weak than wicked. And this beneficial influence would be preserved and strengthened under equal laws. It does not depend on the woman's servitude, but is, on the contrary, diminished by the disrespect which the inferior class of men always at heart feels towards those who are subject to their power. But when we ascend higher in the scale, we come among a totally different set of moving forces. The wife's influence tends, as far as it goes, to prevent the husband from falling below the common standard of approbation of the country. It tends quite as strongly to hinder him from rising above it. The wife is the auxiliary of the common public opinion. A man who is married to a woman his inferior in intelligence finds her a perpetual dead weight, or, worse than a dead weight, a drag upon every aspiration of his to be better than the public opinion requires him to be. It is hardly possible for one who is in these bonds to attain exalted virtue. If he differs in his opinion from the mass, if he sees truths which have not yet been dawned upon them, or if, feeling in his heart truths which they nominally recognize, he would like to act up to those truths more conscientiously than the generality of mankind. To all such thoughts and desires, marriage is the heaviest of drawbacks, unless he be so fortunate as to have a wife as much above the common level as he himself is. For, in the first place, there is always some sacrifice of personal interest required, either of social consequence or of pecuniary means, perhaps the risk even of the means of subsistence. These sacrifices and risks he may be willing to encounter for himself, but he will pause before he imposes them on his family. And his family, in this case, means his wife and daughters, for he always hopes that his sons will feel as he feels himself, and that what he can do without, they will do without, willingly, is the same cause. But his daughters, their marriage may depend on it, and his wife, who is unable to enter into or understand the objects for which these sacrifices are made, who, if she thought them worthy any sacrifice, would think so on trust and solely for his sake, who could participate in none of the enthusiasm or self-approbation he himself may feel, while the things which he is disposed to sacrifice are all in all to her. Will not the best and most selfish man hesitate the longest before bringing on her this consequence? If it be not the comforts of life, but only social consideration, that is at stake, the burthen upon his conscience and feelings is still very severe. Whoever has a wife and children has given hostages to Mrs. Grundy. The approbation of that potentiate may be a matter of indifference to him, but it is of greatest importance to his wife. The man himself may be above opinion, or may find sufficient compensation in the opinion of those of his own way of thinking, but to the women connected with him he can offer no compensation. The almost invariable tendency of the wife to place her influence in the same scale with social consideration is sometimes made a reproach to women, and represented as a peculiar trait of feebleness and childishness of character in them, surely with great injustice. Society makes the whole life of a woman in the easy classes a continued self-sacrifice. It exacts from her an unremitting restraint of the whole of her natural inclinations, and the sole return it makes to her, for what often deserves the name of a martyrdom, is consideration. Her consideration is inseparably connected with that of her husband, and after paying the full price of it, she finds that she is to lose it, for no reason of which she can feel the cogency. She has sacrificed her whole life to it, and her husband will not sacrifice it to a whim, a freak, an eccentricity, something not recognized or allowed for by the world, and which the world will agree with her in thinking a folly, if it thinks no worse. The dilemma is hardest upon that very meritorious class of men who, without possessing talents which qualify them to make a figure among those whom they agree in opinion, hold their opinion from conviction, and feel bound in honor and conscience to serve it, by making profession of their belief, and giving their time, labor, and means to anything undertaken in its behalf. The worst case of all is when such men happen to be of a rank and position which of itself neither gives them nor excludes them from what is considered the best society, when their admission to it depends mainly on what is thought of them personally, and however unexceptionable their breeding and habits, their being identified with opinions and public conduct unacceptable to those who give the tone of society, would operate as an effectual exclusion. Many a woman flatters herself, 9 times out of 10 quite erroneously, that nothing prevents her and her husband from moving in the highest society of her neighborhood, society in which others well known to her, and in the same class of life, mix freely, except that her husband is unfortunately a dissenter, or has the reputation of mingling in low radical politics. That is, she thinks, which hinders George from getting a commission or a place, Caroline from making an advantageous match, and prevents her and her husband from obtaining invitations, perhaps honors, which, for aught she sees, they are as well entitled to as some folks. With such an influence in every house, either exerted actively, or operating all the more powerfully for not being asserted, is it any wonder that people in general are kept down in that mediocrity of respectability which is becoming a marked characteristic of modern times? There is another very injurious aspect in which the effect, not of women's disabilities directly, but of the broad line of difference which those disabilities create between the education and character of a woman and that of a man, requires to be considered. Nothing can be more unfavorable to that union of thoughts and inclinations which is the ideal of married life. Intimate society between people radically dissimilar to one another is an idle dream. Unlikeness may attract, but it is likeness which retains. And in proportion to the likeness is the sustainability of the individuals to give each other a happy life. While women are so unlike men, it is not wonderful that selfish men should feel the need of arbitrary power in their own hands, to arrest in limina the lifelong conflict of inclinations, by deciding every question on the side of their own preference. When people are extremely unlike, there can be no real identity of interest. Very often there is conscientious difference of opinion between married couple on the highest points of duty. Is there any reality in the marriage union where this takes place? Yet it is not uncommon anywhere, when the woman has an earnestness of character, and it is a very general case in Catholic countries, when she is supported in her dissent by the only other authority to which she is taught to bow, the priest. With the usual barefacedness of power not accustomed to find itself disputed, the influence of priests over women is attacked by Protestant and liberal writers, less for being bad in itself, than because it is a rival authority to the husband, and raises up a revolt against his infallibility. In England, similar differences occasionally exist when an evangelical wife has allied herself with a husband of a different quality. But in general, this source at least of dissension is got rid of, by reducing the minds of women to such a nullity that they have no opinions but those of Mrs. Grundy, or those which the husband tells them to have. When there is no difference of opinion, differences merely of taste may distract greatly from the happiness of married life, and, though it may stimulate the amatory propensities of men, it does not conduce to married happiness to exaggerate by differences of education whatever may be the native differences of the sexes. If the married pair are well-bred and well-behaved people, they tolerate each other's tastes. But is mutual toleration what people look forward to when they enter into marriage? These differences of inclination will naturally make their wishes different, if not restrained by affection or duty, as to almost all domestic questions which arise. What a difference there must be in the society which the two persons will wish to frequent, or be frequented by! Each will desire associations who share their own tastes. The persons agreeable to one will be indifferent or positively disagreeable to the other. Yet there can be none who are not common to both, for married people do not now live in different parts of the house, and have totally different visiting lists, as in the reign of Louis XV. They cannot help having different wishes as to the bringing up of the children. Each will wish to see reproduced in them their own tastes and sentiments, and there is either a compromise, and only a half satisfaction to either, or the wife has to yield, often with bitter suffering, and, with or without intention, her occult influence continues to counterwork the husband's purposes. It would, of course, be extreme folly to suppose that these differences of feeling and inclination only exist because women are brought up differently from men, and that there would not be differences of taste under any imaginable circumstances. But there is nothing beyond the mark in saying that the distinction in bringing up immensely aggravates those differences, and renders them wholly inevitable. While women are brought up as they are, a man and a woman will but rarely find in one another a real agreement of tastes and wishes as to daily life. They will generally have to give it up as hopeless, and renounce the attempt to have, in the immediate associate of their daily life, that idem vile, idem nole, which is the recognized bond of any society that is really such. Or, if the man succeeds in obtaining it, he does so by choosing a woman who is so complete a nullity that she has no vili or nole at all, and is as ready to comply with one thing as another if anybody tells her to do so. Even this calculation is apt to fail. Dullness and want of spirit are not always a guarantee of the submission which is so confidently expected from them. But if they were, is this the ideal of marriage? What, in this case, does the man obtain by it, except an upper servant, a nurse, or a mistress? On the contrary, when each of two persons, instead of being a nothing, is a something, when they are attached to one another, and are not too much unlike to begin with, the constant partaking in the same things, assisted by their sympathy, draws out the latent capabilities of each for being interested in the things which were at first interesting only to the other, and works a gradual assimilation of the tastes and characters to one another, partly by the insensible modification of each, but more by a real enriching of the two natures, each acquiring the tastes and capabilities of the other in addition to its own. This often happens between two friends of the same sex who are much associated in their daily life, and it would be a common, if not the commonest, case in marriage did not the totally different bringing up of the two sexes make it next to an impossibility to form a really well-assorted union. Were this remedied, whatever differences there might still be in individual tastes, there would at least be, as a general rule, complete unity and unanimity as to the great objects of life. When the two persons both care for great objects, and are a help and encouragement to each other in whatever regards these, the minor matters of which their tastes may differ are not all important to them, and there is a foundation for a solid friendship of an enduring character, more likely than anything else to make it, through the whole of their life, a greater pleasure to each to give pleasure to the other than to receive it. I have considered thus far the effects on the pleasures and benefits of the marriage union which depend on the mere unlikeness between the wife and the husband. But the evil tendency is prodigiously aggravated when the unlikeness is inferiority. Mere unlikeness, when it only means difference of good qualities, may be more a benefit in the way of mutual improvement than a drawback from comfort. When each emulates, and desires and endeavors to acquire, the other's peculiar qualities, the difference does not produce diversity of interest, but increased identity of it, and makes each still more valuable to the other. But when one is much the inferior of the two in mental ability and cultivation, and is not actively attempting by the other's aid to rise to the other's level, the whole influence of the connection upon the development of the superior of the two is deteriorating, and still more so in a tolerably happy marriage than in an unhappy one. It is not with the impunity that the superior in intellect shuts himself up with an inferior, and elects that inferior for his chosen and sole completely intimate associate. Any society which is not improving is deteriorating, and the more so, the closer and more familiar it is. Even a really superior man almost always begins to deteriorate when he is habitually, as the phrase is, king of his company. And in his most habitual company, the husband who has a wife inferior to him is always so. When his self-satisfaction is incessantly ministered to on the other hand, on the other he insensibly imbibes the modes of feeling and of looking at things which belong to a more vulgar and a more limited mind than his own. This evil differs from many of those which have hitherto been dwelt on, by being an increasing one. The association of men and women in daily life is much closer and more complete than it ever was before. Men's life is more domestic. Formerly, their pleasures and chosen occupations were among men, and in men's company. Their wives had but a fragment of their lives. At the present time, the progress of civilization and the turn of opinion against the rough amusements and convivial excesses which formerly occupied most men in their hours of relaxation, together with, it must be said, the improved tone of modern feeling as to the reciprocity of duty which binds the husband towards the wife, have thrown the man very much more upon the home and its inmates for his personal and social pleasures, while the kind and degree of improvement which has been made in women's education has made them in some degree capable of being his companions in ideas and mental tastes, while leaving them in most cases still hopelessly inferior to him. His desire of mental communion is thus in general satisfied by a communion from which he learns nothing. An unimproving and unstimulating companionship is substituted for what he might otherwise have been obliged to seek, the society of his equals in power and his fellows in the higher pursuits. We see, accordingly, that young men of the greatest promise generally cease to improve as soon as they marry, and, not improving, inevitably degenerate. If the wife does not push the husband forward, she always holds him back. He ceases to care for what she does not care for, he no longer desires, and ends by disliking and shunning society congenial to his former aspirations, and which would now shame his falling off from them. His higher faculties both of mind and heart cease to be called into activity. And this change coinciding with the new and selfish interests which are created by the family, after a few years he differs in no material respect from those who have never had wishes for anything but the common vanities and the common pecuniary objects. What marriage may be in the case of two persons of cultivated faculties, identical in opinions and purposes, between whom there exists the best kind of equality, similarity of powers and capabilities, with reciprocal superiority in them, so that each can enjoy the luxury of looking up to the other, and can have alternatively the pleasure of leading and being led in the path of development, I will not attempt to describe. To those who can conceive it, there is no need, and to those who cannot, it would appear the dream of an enthusiast. But I maintain, with the profoundest conviction, that this, and this only, is the ideal of marriage, and that all opinions, customs, and institutions which favor any other notion of it, or turn the conceptions and aspirations connected with it into any other direction, by whatever pretenses they may be colored, are relics of primitive barbarism. The moral regeneration of mankind will only really commence when the most fundamental of the social relations is placed under the rule of equal justice, and when human beings learn to cultivate their strongest sympathy with an equal in nights and in cultivation. Thus far, the benefits which it has appeared that the world would gain by ceasing to make sex a disqualification for privileges and a badge of subjection are social rather than individual, consisting in an increase of the general fund of thinking and acting power, and an improvement in the general conditions of the association of men and women. But it would be a grievous understatement of the case to omit the most direct benefit of all, the unspeakable gain in the private happiness to the liberated half of the species. The difference to them between a life of subjection to the will of others and a life of rational freedom. After the primary necessities of food and raiment, freedom is the first and strongest want of human nature. While mankind are lawless, their desire is for lawless freedom. When they have learnt to understand the meaning of duty and the value of reason, they incline more and more to be guided and restrained by these in the exercise of their freedom. But they do not, therefore, desire freedom less. They do not become disposed to accept the will of other people as the representative and interpreter of those guiding principles. On the contrary, the communities in which the reason has been most cultivated, and in which the idea of social duty has been most powerful, are those which have most strongly asserted the freedom of action of the individual, the liberty of each to govern his conduct by his own feelings of duty, and by such laws and social restraints as his own conscience can subscribe to. He who would rightly appreciate the worth of personal independence as an element of happiness should consider the value he himself puts on it as an ingredient of his own. There is no subject on which there is a greater habitual difference of judgment between a man judging for himself and the same man judging for other people. When he hears others complaining that they are not allowed freedom of action, that their own will has not sufficient influence in the regulation of their affairs, his inclination is to ask, what are their grievances, what positive damage they sustain, and in what respect they consider their affairs to be mismanaged. And if they fail to make out, in answer to these questions, what appears to him a sufficient case, he turns a deaf ear and regards their complaint as the fanciful querulousness of people whom nothing reasonable will satisfy. But he has a quite different standard of judgment when he is deciding for himself. Then the most unexceptionable administration of his interests by a tutor set over him does not satisfy his feelings. His personal exclusion from the deciding authority itself appears the greatest grievance of all, rendering it superfluous even to enter into the question of mismanagement. It is the same with nations. What citizen of a free country would listen to any offers of good and skillful administration in return for the abdication of freedom? Even if he could believe that good and skillful administration can exist among a people ruled by a will not their own, would not the consciousness of working out their own destiny under their own moral responsibility be a compensation to his feelings for great rudeness and imperfection in the dealings of public affairs? Let him rest assured that whatever he feels on this point, women feel in fully equal degree. Whatever has been said or written from the time of Herodotus to the present, of the ennobling influence of free government, the nerve and spring which it gives to all the faculties, the larger and higher objects which it presents to the intellect and feelings, the more unselfish public spirit, and calmer and broader views of duty that it engenders, and the generally loftier platform on which it elevates the individual as a moral, spiritual, and social being, is every particle as true of women as of men. Are these things no important part of individual happiness? Let any man call to mind what he himself felt on emerging from boyhood, from the tutelage and control of even loved and affectionate elders, and entering upon the responsibilities of manhood. Was it not like the physical effect of taking off a heavy weight, or releasing him from obstructive, even if not otherwise painful, bonds? Did he not feel twice as much alive, twice as much a human being as before? And does he imagine that women have none of these feelings? But it is a striking fact that the satisfactions and mortifications of personal pride, though all in all to most men when the case is their own, have less allowance made for them in the case of other people, and are less listened to as a ground or justification of conduct than any other natural human feelings. Perhaps because men compliment them in their own case with the names of so many other qualities, that they are seldom conscious how mighty an influence these feelings exercise in their own lives. No less large and powerful is their part, we may assure ourselves, in the lives and feelings of women. Women are schooled into suppressing them in their most natural and most healthy direction, but the internal principle remains in a different outward form. An active and energetic mind, if denied liberty, will seek for power. Refused the command of itself, it will assert its personality by attempting to control others. To allow any human beings no existence of their own but what depends on others is giving far too high a premium on bending others to their purposes. Where liberty cannot be hoped for, and power can, power becomes the grand object of human desire. Those to whom others will not leave the undisturbed management of their own affairs will compensate themselves, if they can, by meddling for their own purposes with the affairs of others. Hence also women's passion for personal beauty and dress and display, and all the evils that flow from it, in the way of mischievous luxury and social immorality. The love of power and the love of liberty are in eternal antagonism. Where there is least liberty, the passion for power is the most ardent and unscrupulous. The desire for power over others can only cease to be a depraving agency among mankind when each of them individually is able to do without it, which can only be where respect for liberty in the personal concerns of each is an established principle. But it is not only through the sentiment of personal dignity that the free direction and disposal of their own faculties is a source of individual happiness, and to be fettered and restricted in it a source of unhappiness to human beings, and not least to women. There is nothing, after disease, indigence, and guilt, so fatal to the pleasurable enjoyment of life as the want of a worthy outlet for the active faculties. Women who have the cares of a family, and while they have the cares of a family, have this outlet, and it generally suffices for them. But what of the greatly increasing number of women who have had no opportunity of exercising the vocation which they are mocked by telling them is their proper one? What of the women whose children have been lost to them by death or distance, or have grown up, married, and formed homes of their own? There are abundant examples of men who, after a life engrossed by business, retire with a competency to the enjoyment, as they hope, of rest, but to whom, as they are unable to acquire new interests and excitements that can replace the old, the change to a life of inactivity brings ennui, melancholy, and premature death. Yet no one thinks of the parallel case of so many worthy and devoted women who, having paid what they are told is their debt to society, have brought up a family blamelessly to manhood and womanhood, having kept a house so long as they have a house needing to be kept, are deserted by the sole occupation for which they have fitted themselves, and remain with undiminished activity but with no employment for it, unless perhaps a daughter or daughter-in-law is willing to abdicate in their favor the discharge of the same functions in her young household. Surely a hard lot for the old age of those who have worthily discharged, as long as it was given to them to discharge, what the world accounts their only social duty. Of such women, and of those to whom this duty has not been committed at all, many of whom pine through life with the consciousness of thwarted vocations, in activities which are not suffered to expand, the only resources, speaking generally, are religion and charity. But their religion, though it may be one of feeling and of ceremonial observance, cannot be a religion of action unless in the form of charity. For charity many of them are by nature admirably fitted, but to practice it usefully, or even without doing mischief, requires the education and the manifold preparation, the knowledge and the thinking powers of a skillful administrator. There are few of the administrative functions of government for which a person would not be fit who is fit to bestow charity usefully. In this, as in other cases, preeminently in that of the education of children, the duties permitted to women cannot be performed properly without their being trained for duties which, to the great loss of society, are not permitted to them. And here let me notice the singular way in which the question of women's disabilities is frequently presented to view, by those who find it easier to draw a ludicrous picture of what they do not like, than to answer the arguments for it. When it is suggested that women's executive capabilities and prudent counsels might sometimes be found valuable in the affairs of state, these lovers of fun hold up to the ridicule of the world, as sitting in Parliament or in the Cabinet, girls in their teens, or young wives of 2 or 3 and 20, transported bodily exactly as they are from the drawing-room to the House of Commons. They forget that males are not usually selected at this early age for a seat in Parliament, or for responsible political functions. Common sense would tell them that if such trusts were confided to women, it would be to such as having no special vocation for married life, or preferring other employment of their faculties, as many women even now prefer to marriage some of the few honorable occupations within their reach, have spent the best years of their youth in attempting to qualify themselves for the pursuits in which they desire to engage, or, still more frequently perhaps, widows or wives of 40 or 50, by whom the knowledge of life and faculty of government which they have acquired in their families could, by the aid of appropriate studies, be made available on a less contracted scale. There is no country of Europe in which the ablest men have not frequently experienced and keenly appreciated the value of the advice and help of clever and experienced women of the world in attainment both of private and of public objects. And there are important matters of public administration to which few men are equally competent as such women, among others the detailed control of expenditure. But what we are now discussing is not the need which society has of the services of women in public business, but the dull and hopeless life to which it so often condemns them, by forbidding them to exercise the practical abilities which many of them are conscious of, in a wider field than one to which some of them never was, and to the others is no longer, open. If there is anything vitally important to the happiness of human beings, it is that they should relish their habitual pursuit. This requisite of an enjoyable life is very imperfectly granted, or altogether denied, to a large part of mankind, and by its absence many a life is a failure which is provided in appearance with every requisite of success. But if circumstances which society is not yet skilful enough to overcome render such failures often for the present inevitable, society need not itself inflict them. The injudiciousness of parents, a youth's own inexperience, or the absence of external opportunities for the congenial vocation, and their presence for an uncongenial, condemn numbers of men to pass their lives in doing one thing reluctantly and ill, when there are other things which they could have done well and happily. But on women this sentence is imposed by actual law, and by customs equivalent to law. What in unenlightened societies, color, race, religion, or in the case of a conquered country, nationality, are to some men, sex is to all women. A peremptory exclusion from almost all honorable occupations, but either as such cannot be fulfilled by others, or such as those others do not think worthy of their acceptance. Sufferings arising from causes of this nature usually meet with so little sympathy, that few persons are aware of the great amount of unhappiness even now produced by the feeling of wasted life. The case will be even more frequent as increased cultivation creates a greater and greater disproportion between the ideas and faculties of women and the scope which society allows to their activity. When we consider the positive evil caused to the disqualified half of the human race by their disqualification, first in the loss of the most inspiriting and elevating kind of personal enjoyment, and next in the weariness, disappointment, and profound dissatisfaction with life, which are so often the substitute for it, one feels that among all the lessons which men require for carrying on the struggle against the inevitable imperfections of their lot on earth, there is no lesson which they more need than not to add to the evils which nature inflicts by their jealous and prejudiced restrictions on one another. Their vain fears only substitute other and worse evils for those which they are idly apprehensive of, while every restraint on the freedom of conduct of any of their human fellow creatures, otherwise than by making them responsible for an evil actually caused by it, dries up pro tanto the principal foundation of human happiness, and leaves the species less rich to an inappreciable degree in all that makes life valuable to the individual human being. End of Chapter 4, Part 2. Recording by Nikki Sullivan, Chicago. End of The Subjection of Women by John Stuart Mill.